Thanks, guys. It's pretty intimidating coming up after Don Bogey. I kind of know how Scott felt this morning, standing up after Simon with his real scientific presentation. I think the only difference is that Scott's pretty smart. And he works at Milford, and I was probably dropped on my head a few times as a kid, and I work at Whakapapa. No? Cool. Yeah, sweet. So I'm just going to do a bit of a chat about managing uncertainty. So most of the examples in this are kind of geared towards ski area work because that's my background, but I think it's equally as applicable to other aspects like guiding or recreating or forecasting. So this is the basic structure for assessing avalanche hazard and risk. So you gather your obs and info, and then from that stuff you work out what type of problem, the location in the terrain, then you figure out your likelihood of triggering and the size. And that gives you your hazard, and then after that you throw in an element at risk, so that's something of value that could be impacted by the avalanches, and you figure out its vulnerability and exposure to the hazard, and that gives you risk. So it looks real straightforward, and it is, but I think what's not shown in this process or in this diagram here are the sort of really grey areas that exist in every step of this process. You can get snowpack test scores that give you really conflicting information, or a size to avalanche might bury one person, or you might get spat off to the side and have no injuries at all. So I think we often find ourselves sort of sitting on the fence trying to make a decision at any part within this, and this is uncertainty, and that's, you know, it's inherent in avalanche work, and I think it's probably arguably one of the most challenging parts of the whole process. It's definitely not a new concept in avalanche work at all, like it's been around for ages and most operations probably discuss it daily. On the InfoX, there's got things like the hazard analysis tool. It's got its own box for showing areas of uncertainty, and when you're plotting your hazard on the graph, users can show your uncertainty by adjusting the shape of that grey blob which represents your avalanche problem. But I don't think there's been real widespread use of a really structured way to actually manage this uncertainty in operations at this stage anyway. There's plenty of people that are really good at managing uncertainty, and I think especially people that have been in the game for a real long time, but I'd probably be quite accurate in saying that most of these people, or at least some of them, probably do this based on really solid intuition, which is a totally valid thing, but it takes years if not decades to develop, lots of trial and error and experience. So I think having a much better or deeper understanding about uncertainty, some structured ways to manage it, this can really help speed this process up and make all of us probably much more efficient and effective at managing it. So I'm going to start by giving a bit of detail around uncertainty, and then some strategies for how to manage it, and then a bit of a case study to kind of show this stuff in action. So there's lots of different ways you can break down uncertainty depending on what discipline you're working in, but in the avalanche world it's starting to become a bit more common to break it down into two types, so knowledge source uncertainty and natural uncertainty. So if you want to sound real tech, some people call them epistemic and aleatoric. So knowledge source uncertainty, this results from a lack of knowledge or gaps in data. So this is stuff that we could know in principle but we don't know in practice. So this can be reduced by using methods and techniques that exist and are at our disposal. The natural uncertainty is more about the natural randomness or natural variability of things that we just can't predict, like trying to guess what the outcome is going to be if you flip a coin or if you roll a dice. So this can't be reduced. So this looks really clear, but in reality, uncertainty doesn't always slot nicely into exactly one or the other of these two types. It can have components of both to it, which can make it a bit confusing. But for the purpose of this presentation, we can definitively split it up using these two ideas here. So I think of it as, if you can and will reduce that uncertainty, then we can just call it as knowledge source, and if you can't or won't reduce it, then we're going to call it natural uncertainty. This might not be absolutely technically correct, but it works for the purpose of the ideas that I'm going to talk about. So some examples of the stuff in the avalanche world. Let's say we're out skiing and you have a quick dig and we notice this big gritty depth hole layer at the base of the snowpack. At this stage we haven't done any tests on it or anything, so we've just visually observed it. So we might have some uncertainty maybe around the sensitivity of this depth hole layer. So this would be knowledge source uncertainty, because there's practical things that we can do, there's tools that we've got that we can use to reduce it. So you could do things like a compression test or an extended column test, or you could ski cut some small safe slopes, and all these things they'd give you more information about the sensitivity of that depth ore layer, and which would then reduce our uncertainty a little bit. So for a different example, let's say we've got a buried weak layer distributed across this entire face, and we've got a bunch of different start zones across this face which have got relatively similar terrain characteristics in terms of their angle, aspect, elevation. So if we get 3 bombs, because we work on a skier, which is awesome, and we place them in these locations here, they all go off, but we only trigger 1 avalanche here. If we take 3 more bombs and we place them where these green question marks are, and we ask ourselves, will these bombs trigger avalanches? Now we're dealing with natural uncertainty. We know the weak layer exists. We know that in some places we can trigger it with a bomb. We know that in other places it doesn't, and the terrain's relatively similar. So we're kind of just dealing with the natural variability of that weak layer. From here on out, it's just a random guess, basically, as to whether we'd trigger anything or not. So those are our 2 types. We've got knowledge source and natural uncertainty. So now we'll cover some ideas on how to manage them, because we've got to treat them differently. So knowledge source uncertainty, that's the one that we can reduce. This is managed by reducing what is practical. And what's practical for one operational situation can be unpractical for another one due to a bunch of things like the nature of your operation, staffing levels, time, resources, anything like that, or just your motivational levels maybe. So we reduce this knowledge source uncertainty in avalanche work by generally gathering targeted observations that are geared towards the information that we're lacking. So this could be anything from doing snow profiles to find out more about the presence of a weak layer, or just visual observations of your terrain to figure out more about the distribution of a wind slab problem. Another good idea is that you can use independent methods that target the same information. So a real good example of this for us would be if we've got uncertainty around maybe the propagation potential of a weak layer. You could do an extended column test and a propagation saw test. They're 2 different independent methods that both test for the same thing, being that propagation of that weak layer, and they do that by stressing or loading the snowpack in different ways. And we're never going to reduce all of the uncertainty, so the remaining knowledge source uncertainty is then included in our decisions and actions. So natural uncertainty, this is the one that we can't reduce, so we manage this by including it in our decisions and actions. So that's exactly the same as the residual or remaining knowledge source uncertainty from that left-hand column you're looking at. So including this means we just use the idea of a margin of safety, which is pretty self-explanatory, but it's how conservative you choose to make your decisions or actions. So we can achieve that in a variety of ways depending on what you're uncertain about. It could be just choosing what type of avalanche control method you're going to use. So you might ski cut a slope, or you might use a belayed ski cut, or you might use explosives, or you might just avoid the terrain altogether and just close and let time do its thing. So it's all good to say margin of safety, but it's also good to have a gauge on how big your margin of safety should be. And there's no black and white answer to this, but generally speaking, the higher the uncertainty and the higher the consequences of the situation you're dealing with, this requires a much bigger margin of safety, and vice versa. So you can think of loads of examples for how you might manage that one. And then we need to be able to work out, or at least confirm, our level of uncertainty. So the following points that I'm going to talk about, and these aren't an exhaustive list at all, it's just some, but these are just some of the common ideas and common factors that pop up in high and low uncertainty situations. So being aware of these, I think, can help us kind of confirm that we're treating a situation correctly, or they can prompt us to rethink it and maybe consider a wider range of outcomes. So some of the common ingredients for high uncertainty situations are lack of experience. So if you don't have sort of really sufficient experience with a type of avalanche problem or a situation, then there's a good chance you haven't seen the range of plausible outcomes for it. I think it's good to note that even really experienced people will have high uncertainty often around problems like glide slab or wet slab or deep persistent slab, because these are they're much less frequent, they're real tricky to forecast, and I think if we're honest, we just try and stay well away from them because they're real scary and dangerous. Lack of feedback's another one. So if you can't do any direct slope testing to test your assessments or your theories, then it's really hard to know how accurate you are. But I think it's also important to consider how valuable your feedback is. So if you ski cut a slope and you trigger it, then that's real good feedback for sure. But if you don't trigger it, it doesn't necessarily mean that that slope was safe. What if you were 2 meters to the left or you had 3 people on the slope at the same time? I think it's these kind of grey areas that we should really, put a light up to show that we're in a high uncertainty situation. So, if you can do a snowpack test and you get a layer to pop out at you, but then you ski cut a slope and you can't trigger it, that's one of those key situations. And high variability. So if the data and evidence you've got is showing significant variation, then chances are you're in a high uncertainty situation. So that could be anything from widely varying snowpack test scores or just lots of variation in slab depth across a slope as you probe your way across it. So now for low uncertainty situations, it's kind of obvious, but these are more or less the opposite of the high uncertainty ones. But targeted experience. So generally speaking, the more experience you've got with the type of problem or a scenario or a situation, the lower your uncertainty will be. But that's provided that your experience is really solid and meaningful and you haven't kind of just got by on sheer luck in the past through those experiences or just winging it. And having good data and evidence to support what you're thinking. So I think if it's really well targeted for the information or for the problem that you're grappling with, then that's a real good start. And for example, if you've got a loose wet avalanche problem, things like ski penetration, level of solar radiation, sky cover, air temp, things like that are really good targeted information for that type of problem. And I think to go a little bit deeper into this last point, it's really good to cover the idea of weighing evidence, because this is something that you can do to help figure out if the evidence you've got is any good or not. So from a cognitive point of view, evidence has got it's got two attributes. So it's got strength and it's got weight, and these two things, they need to be kind of balanced or evaluated so that we can make sure that we're using the evidence correctly and we're not placing more or less emphasis than what it's actually worth. So the strength is about how convincingly or how persuasively the information that we've got supports one idea over another. This is like the real sensational, kind of amazing, in-your-face aspect of evidence, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the evidence is any good. So if you think about the stereotype of a used car salesman, they can be real convincing, real persuasive, but it doesn't necessarily mean that what they're saying to you is true or it's going to lead you to make a good decision. The weight, on the other hand, this is the one we want. So this is how good the evidence is in terms of its quality and its quantity and its predictive validity. So how much information have you got from how many sources, how reliable are those sources, and when we look at our evidence all together, how useful is it at predicting the outcome of what we really want to know? Now, when we process these two attributes, the strength and the weight, our brains do it sequentially. So the strength always hits us first, which is kind of the problematic thing, and then the useful one, the weight, comes to us. And what can often happen, especially when the strength is really high, is that the weight can go unnoticed in the background. The strength really dazzles us and we kind of get drawn into that, whereas the weight's just kind of chilling in the background over here, not getting in our attention. So I think being aware that this can happen, this can help us realise that we've got to tone down the strength a bit when we're assessing evidence and put a bit more consideration and emphasis on the weight. You kind of really got to tease it out of it. So that's the concept of it. So I guess an example of this stuff would be, let's say we're at the ski area at Whakapapa and we show up real early in the morning after a storm. The weather station's frozen up, so we've got no data from that. So we check in with the night shift groomers because they've been out driving all night, so we want to get some obs from them. And they come back saying, yep, we've had 20 centimetres of new snow, strong southwest winds, and we triggered a decent avalanche from blading the toe out of a slope called the Second Waterfall a couple of hours ago on the way up to the cat shed. So this has definitely got high strength for starters. There's been new snow, there's been wind, and they triggered an avalanche. It's like, what's not to like about that? But before we kind of sprint to the mag and start making up 50 shots and sending control teams out over the whole mountain, it's probably important to stop and consider its weight. So if we think about the weight of this, we've got information from only one source, the night shift groomers. Those guys have got basic avalanche training, so that may not be highly reliable. There's been report of an avalanche, but only from one slope, and we've got 250 start zones in the ski area. We don't know how many other start zones they may have bladed the toe out of and not triggered anything at all. So at the moment, we're sitting high strength but low weight. There's every possibility that when the sun comes up and we can see, we might notice that all the new snow's been blown way down to the bottom of the start zones, we don't have much of a problem at all. So realising we're at low weight, the next thing would be to set about rectifying that and getting some better evidence. So then we have 3 patrollers we're with, send them out on skis and snowmobiles with headlamps on to go get some obs from around the ski area from really key targeted test slopes. And they come back saying 20 to 40 centimetre wind slabs, one size 1.5 cat triggered avalanche, no naturals, shooting cracks, extended column tests were consistently propagating, and ski cuts produced numerous size 1 on small test slopes. So at this point, we've now added significant weight to our pool of evidence. The quality's gone up, the quantity of it's gone up, and overall, when we look at all of our evidence together, it's pretty useful at predicting that we've got a significant wind slab problem that we need to deal with before we can open the ski area. Cool, so that's the strength and weight. So now I'll do a bit of a case study to show how we managed a high uncertainty situation last season, using the points that I've talked about, but in a really structured way so we could kind of just chip through it. So this was late September, early October. We had 5 days of heavy rain, really warm, so rain to all elevations within the ski area, and this completely saturated the snowpack, so pretty classic Whakapapa. And then after that it got colder and the precip turned to snow, and we had 3 days of snow and ramping up westerlies. So the end result was we had anywhere between 50 centimetres to 230 centimetres of new wind-loaded snow packed on top of that really wet, weak, rotten snow underneath it. And throughout this process, we had really limited observations as well. So because of the poor weather and travel conditions, we only had a handful of snowpack obs from small test slopes in very few locations at and below 2,000 metres. And we had no obs above 2,000 metres. And that's kind of where our main terrain of concern is for wet slab problems at Whakapapa, which is steep unsupported or big start zones. So you can see in the photo here, the one on the left, you can see that darker, really wet, weak, rotten snow, and then covered by a slab of new snow over top. And the picture on the right shows the upper range of the slab depths that we'd found. And this was at the same elevation, just at 2,000 metres. Same aspect slopes, but just around the corner a little bit from it, so there's heaps of variation. The setup for this was remarkably similar to wet slab cycles that we'd had in 2016 and 2017. So the profile on the left is a fracture line profile from an explosive triggered slab that we got in 2016, and the current situation's on the right. So both profiles show that wet, weak snow at the bottom and a significant slab of new wind-loaded snow sitting over top of it. And there's a melt freeze crust, that line that sticks out further in both profiles, and that's kind of one of the key factors in these problems. The thicker and the stronger that is, the more it's likely to bridge over the weak stuff underneath, which then decreases the sensitivity, but it's real hard to try and gauge when it's strong enough. This clip here shows the avalanche being triggered from that fracture line profile, so it just gives you a bit of an idea as to why we were kind of on full alert, really. Cool. So the first thing we had to do with managing the situation was work out, or at least confirm, our level of uncertainty. As you can probably guess, we already had a pretty good idea, but it's good to check yourself against these things so that you're treating the situation correctly. So limited experience with forecasting wet slabs. I've been at Whakapapa for 16 years and I've only dealt with 2 cyclones previously, so experience is definitely low with dealing with them. Minimal feedback. So we'd done very limited testing of this problem below 2,000 metres and no testing above 2,000 metres. The weather station had iced up as well, so where it actually mattered, we had basically no testing or feedback. Had high variability, so the slab depth ranged from 50 centimetres to up to 230 centimetres. And one of the key things was that our evidence had low weight. We only had a really limited number of observations from a limited number of locations, and it was really difficult to extrapolate that information to the start zones up above 2,000 metres where it really mattered. So unsurprisingly, we were in a high uncertainty situation, but this was really good to just confirm that. Next thing was managing the uncertainty. So we needed to do 3 things. It was kind of a 3-step process for this. So we had to figure out our sources of uncertainty and then break them up into what types of uncertainty they were they natural or knowledge source, and then apply an appropriate strategy for managing those uncertainties based on what type of uncertainty it was and what the source of it was. So we kind of narrowed it down to two main things that we really wanted to figure out to make the situation a bit easier. The first one was, where was there enough new slab over the wet snow to be a problem? So this is just about the distribution and the depth of the new wind-loaded snow, not thinking about the wet stuff or the weak stuff underneath. We just wanted to know where it was going to be a problem. So this for us fell into knowledge source uncertainty because there were practical observations that we could make to reduce it. And that's what you want to do. So we did this by, as soon as the weather conditions allowed us to move around, we got out on skis, snowmobiles and in cats to get visual observations of the terrain above 2,000 metres. And this told us about where the new snow had been wind-loaded into and where it had been kind of scoured out from. And then we also got out at those upper elevations and did a whole bunch of probing and just really quick digs on safe representative test slopes to find out about the depth of that new slab. So the other thing that we wanted to figure out was, is the melt freeze crust between the slab and the wet snow strong enough to prevent human triggering? That's kind of what it comes down to for a ski area because we're just throwing skiers onto the slopes. So this was natural uncertainty because there was nothing we could practically do to reduce it. We knew that it existed, but we were dealing with the natural variability of the distribution and strength of a melt freeze crust that we couldn't safely get to and dig down to and do any testing on. So the only thing we could possibly do to figure it out would be to put a human on a big loaded start zone and see if they did trigger an avalanche, but it's kind of outside of our acceptable risk at that time. So, being natural uncertainty, we had to include it by using a margin of safety, and uncertainty was high, and the consequences were obviously high. Think about how deep that slab was. So we needed to use a big margin of safety, which we achieved by making a more conservative control plan. So bigger bombs in more places than we normally would. So every steep unsupported start zone above 2,000 metres got a double shot as opposed to a normal single shot that we'd usually use. And the large ones got 10 kilos of ANFO regardless. So that's how we managed it. Then on to what actually happened in reality. So we triggered 0 avalanches, which was interesting to justify. But yeah, so it was a bit of total non-event in terms of avalanche activity. But I think the key point was that the uncertainty at the outset was far too high for us to just roll the dice, especially given the potential consequences of the situation and what 2016 and 2017 had shown us. So we effectively managed the uncertainty of the situation by using more explosives than normal and by getting really targeted observations. And this reduced it down or managed it down to an acceptable level for us, to the point where we were happy to have staff and public moving throughout our bigger start zones on the upper mountain, and we could confidently say that they wouldn't trigger anything big enough to be a problem for them. So that's kind of the end goal, what we really want to achieve. For this case, it was real important for us to change our mindset for how we use explosives. So if you work on a ski area or use explosives quite a bit, it's easy to start thinking that you just use them as a tool for triggering avalanches to make the ski area safe, because that's what you do most of the time with them. But I think they're equally as effective, if not more, as a tool of managing uncertainty, regardless of if you trigger avalanches or not. And the way I think of it is, in this situation, we could have spent half an hour on each start zone, edging our way onto the side of it, digging, recording layers, exposing ourselves at the same time, doing some tests, or we could take 5 minutes, put a big bomb on every slope, and you'd probably get better information if what you ultimately want to know is, can you open the slope right now or not? So changing that mindset was real good for us for that. And the last point was clearly communicating the uncertainty to the relevant parties for us. So for us, in this situation, the relevant parties were our own team, so it wasn't just stuck inside my head. So the ski patrol team and up the chain to management as well. So by clearly communicating the potential consequences of the situation, the level of uncertainty that you're at, and what's required to manage that down to an acceptable level, this can go a real long way to getting people on board with you. So, to summarise this stuff, basically the points I've talked about and how we used it in a step-by-step structured way, this is kind of what I've come up with for how we roll with some of this stuff. So, get a first get a gauge on your level of uncertainty, or at least confirm it. What are your sources of uncertainty? And then break them up. Are they natural or knowledge source? Reduce the knowledge source where practical. Include the remaining knowledge source uncertainty and then the natural uncertainty as well. And then communicate this to relevant parties or key stakeholders. So to finish up, if you're interested, these are two real good publications that I've found useful for stealing ideas from for this stuff. The first one's Technical Aspects of Snow Avalanche Risk Management by the CAA, and you can download that for free, which is real cool. And the other one's Degrees of Belief, Subjective Probability and Engineering Judgment. So I'm not an engineer. This is written from an engineering point of view, so there's some heavyish reading in there, but some real awesome concepts, not just around managing uncertainty, but about decision making in general. It's me.
Does anyone have any questions for Ryan on his presentation? Yeah.
Hey Ryan, Matt here. Look, just wanted to say first of all, I thought there was an excellent presentation amongst a pretty discerning audience, so well done mate. Really clear, really well presented, thanks. I just wanted to add to what you've said, so rather than ask a question, sort of a couple of supportive things. I can remember back in the early 90s I was doing some avalanche control with a gentleman who's sitting in this room up the front there by the name of Dean Staples. And the two of us were in a start zone called the Highway, and it was on day off, similar circumstance to you. We're trying to work out what we should be doing, whether a groomer should be under it. And we're doing all the stuff that you do, fiddling with the snow, trying to convince ourselves one way or the other. And Dean just simply said, "We've been doing this a long time, eh? How long are we going to think about whether it's okay before we decide it's not?" And I've subsequently called that the Dean Staples thinking about it too long clause. And it actually works incredibly well for both snow safety and also acute medicine. So it's passed all my tests, which is if you're thinking about it too long and you're just not comfortable, you've got two options. One, get more information, or two, default to the safest option. And I think that's probably exactly kind of what you've said here in a really good way. So congratulations.
Cheers. Yeah, I think that brings up a good point that I've kind of been thinking about lots with this recently too, is that I think the start point and the end point for this are most of the time probably going to be the same for most people here, but it's the in-between how you get to it. Whether you've got a structured way to kind of follow through and be confident with where you get to, or whether you're kind of going, I'm going to cross this slope, hold your breath, you pucker up a bit, you get across it, you don't trigger it, the end result's still the same, but I think it's kind of makes the journey much more easy and clear-cut for you, using this stuff. Like, it's not a game changer in terms of your decisions are all of a sudden going to be 180 different, but it's just a structured way of processing that stuff.
Any other questions? Nope. Awesome. Thanks a lot, Ryan. That was great.